Good morning, all. Thank you so much for joining us for a quick 30-minute discussion on the future of recapture. I'm Kristie Peña. I'm the Vice President of Policy and the Director of Immigration at the Niskanen Center in Washington, D.C. And I am delighted to be joined by my colleague, Jeremy Neufeld, today, who is really responsible for driving our team's focus on and understanding of recapture. And more importantly, probably the really tremendous impacts it promises for families, the immigrant workforce, and also for Americans. Jeremy's estimated economic impacts of implementing recapture, which we'll discuss in a lot more detail today, would certainly constitute significant GDP gains. So quickly, by the way of a short background, Jeremy is a graduate of the University of Maryland, where he received a BS in economics. And now in his downtime, he is currently an economics PhD student at George Mason University. So in addition to his academic acumen on recapture, Jeremy's work has been really cutting edge this year. And I want to run through a couple of highlights before we get started. So in June of this year, Jeremy and the Federation of American Scientists published a joint report, Stop the Incinerator, which provided the first estimates of the economic impact of green card recapture, and also provided some important recommendations for how we can reduce green card waste moving forward. So both that report and Jeremy's work since then have been referenced in many news outlets across the country. The Washington Post editorial board has written about it, Bloomberg, Vox, and Jeremy's work was featured in Niskanen senior fellow and prominent author Matt Iglesias' Substack, Slow Boring, which I would strongly encourage you to read in general. In addition to a recent op-ed in The Hill, Jeremy's also published several commentaries available on the Niskanen website at niskanencenter.org that kind of explain recapture in both more detail and also at a high level, which I find I need to reference often. So I urge you to read those resources if you'd like to learn more after our discussion today. Jeremy's also spearheaded a lot of our work in clarifying some of the misconceptions around the legal immigration provisions that we'll talk about today, namely that they would mostly benefit big businesses. And we'll dive into kind of what I'm talking about when I say legal immigration provisions, and also how widespread the benefits of recapture truly are. And finally, before we get started, I want to draw your attention to a recent letter that Niskanen co-led with AILA, the National Immigration Forum, and the American Immigration Council that was signed by I think we ended up with over 95 immigration advocacy organizations and think tanks and civil society groups that truly represent a broad spectrum of constituents and stakeholders across the country to strongly encourage the inclusion of green card recapture and advanced adjustment of status in the reconciliation bill that is still undergoing negotiations. So we are waiting on a potentially transformative moment in immigration. And of course, in addition to potentially providing work authorization for millions of undocumented individuals in the US, recapture is really a policy that is front and center. So I think this conversation is well timed. And to that end, please feel free to submit any questions that you have in the chat. We'll aim to address those either during or at the end of the discussion. But let's kick it off. So to Jeremy, can you talk to our audience a little bit about what recapture is, and tell us a little bit about the historical use of recapture in past years?
Sure. So in order to understand what recapture is, it's useful to understand how green cards are allocated and how they're wasted. So the Immigration Act of 1990 set the current caps on the various green card categories. And since 1990, a certain number of green cards has been made available to immigrants based on what those caps are. But through bureaucratic errors, and more recently because of COVID-19 and the effects of that, embassy closures, and the ending of in-person interviews and travel restrictions, the number of green cards that are actually issued under those provisions is often less than the total number of green cards that are made available. This has always been an issue even before COVID. It's declined over the years as USCIS and the State Department have addressed it to some degree, but this has always been a longstanding issue. And even before COVID-19, there were hundreds of thousands of green cards that were authorized by Congress but were never issued. And COVID has just exacerbated that with the most green card waste in any given year happening last year. Now, recapture is an idea that came about at the end of the 1990s when some green cards had already gone unused in the first decade since the Immigration Act of 1990. And the idea was that Congress could step in after the fact and correct the issues caused by the executive branch not issuing all the green cards that Congress had authorized. And so in 2000, Republicans passed the American Competitiveness in the 21st Century Act, which recaptured about 200,000 green cards, or I'm sorry, about 130,000 green cards. And then again in 2005, in a supplemental appropriations bill, they went back and recaptured an additional 50,000 green cards. So this is an idea with some history. Since 2005, there haven't been any recapture efforts, but it's promising to see that this is an idea that's been rediscovered and has some chance at correcting many years of green card waste.
That's super interesting. And I think, it sort of begs the question, right? If we were correcting for this issue already in the 90s, just after 10 years of setting these limits, it suggests to me that there should be a fix that isn't Congress having to step in every 10 or 15 years or so and correcting for this broken issue. So understanding that a potential solution is probably not immediately going to be something that we can do, what is the solution to not having to go back every 10 years and fix this allocation issue on the back end?
Yeah, there are a few ways that this could be fixed moving forward to prevent green card waste from occurring in the future. Congress could do this on its own by changing the legislation to make sure that when a green card is authorized, that it automatically rolls over without any issues about being incinerated. But the executive branch could also at least address part of the issue of green card waste. The way that they have chosen to implement the Immigration Act of 1990 is that they only consider a green card number as being counted when the visa is in the hands of the immigrant. But that's different from how they interpret how to count other visas in other visa categories, like the H-1B, for example. And so if the administration changed how they are implementing the Immigration Act of 1990 to match more closely to how they count H-1Bs, for instance, that would also prevent some, but not all, green card waste moving forward.
That makes a lot of sense. So we just kind of got a question that I think goes directly to the next point that we want to talk about, which is what these numbers look like and how it would reduce backlogs. So right now there are about 3 different proposals on recapture that are sort of on the table. So can you give us a little bit of information about those 3 proposals and what the numbers look like depending on which proposal we're talking about?
Yes, absolutely. So the way that each proposal addresses green cards changes the precise number that are available for recapture. The Build Back Better Act is the most expansive proposal. It recaptures both unused family visas and unused employment-based visas. And it does that going all the way back to 1990. And it counts each year individually. So it just looks at the number that are unused in each year and then sums it up across years. And that would that leaves about 1 million available green cards to recapture from 1990 to 2021. Of those, about 644,000 of them would be new arrivals. The rest are already in the country. But there's also other proposals. The DHS Appropriations Act recaptures essentially just family-based visas. And it only does that from 2020 to 2021. The total number would be about 272,000. And it doesn't count each year individually, it counts the years together, which can change how the total number comes out. It's not clear that this was intentional, that it would only recapture family-based green cards, but by retroactively reducing the employment caps in previous years, it cancels out the employment-based green card waste in 2021 and 2020. Or to clarify, it cancels out the green card waste in 2021, and because it counts the years, it counts the period together instead of counting the years individually, it also eliminates the employment-based green card waste from 2020. And so it only would recapture green cards on the family side. There's also the Preserving Employment Visas Act, which only recaptures employment-based green cards from 2020 and 2021. And that comes out to about 90,000 green cards, of whom only 16,000 are new arrivals. And then if the executive branch acted alone, again, I mentioned earlier, this can only address part of the green card waste issue because the executive branch can be limited in how it addresses family-based green card waste. And there it is probable that the number of total green cards available for recapture by the executive branch is about 300,000 or 310,000.
That's great. So can you kind of help us put this into context a little bit? You know, we're hearing a lot of numbers. So right now, the backlogs for family-based green cards hover around 4 million, and the backlogs for employment-based green cards hover around about 1 million. So can you walk us through why it's so important to address these backlogs and kind of what the real world impacts are to sort of providing recapture for these folks so that they can get green cards faster?
Yes, so green card backlogs, as you mentioned, are very long as it is, and they're growing over time. And what this translates to for immigrants is increased waiting times. This is somewhat complicated by the per country caps, which distribute the burden of the waiting times unevenly across immigrants. And so in some categories, especially in employment-based categories, the green card backlog might not translate into any additional waiting time for immigrants from countries which are not subject to the per country cap. But for immigrants from countries like India or China, it can mean years or decades of waiting, depending on the green card category. On the family side, again, the waiting times aren't distributed evenly, but almost everybody, if not everybody, does face longer waiting times that are growing over time. And that's what it means for the immigrants themselves. And waiting times mean that the immigrants are, their status is dependent on their employment. It means that their spouses either don't have work authorization at all, or if they do, the status of that is uncertain because it is the result of policy whims of the executive branch. And it means that their children's status is at risk of running out when their children reach adulthood if their parent hasn't gotten a green card yet and they're still on a temporary work visa. And for the economy at large, these waiting times are an enormous drag on our economy, both in terms of keeping people who want to enter the United States and work out of the United States, in terms of keeping people who are in the United States stuck in one job where they might not be as productive as they might otherwise be. Keep some spouses and children out of work. And perhaps most importantly of all, it deters migrants from seeking the United States as a destination. If they can have better opportunities once they account for the waiting time in Canada or Australia or other countries, even if they might get paid less and they might prefer to work in the United States, all else being equal, if they'd have to wait 5 years for the United States and not at all for one of these other countries, it just makes the United States a less attractive destination.
That makes a lot of sense. And I want to give you an opportunity to also touch on the advanced adjustment of status provision, which you talk about as complementary to the recapture provision. So can you tell us kind of what that is and how those two pieces work together?
Yeah, so advanced adjustment of status is a provision that's included in addition to recapture in the Build Back Better Act, and specifically in the House version of that act, and not in the Senate version, at least not yet, although hopefully it might be included. And unlike recapture, this is a newer idea, but essentially it would allow people who are in the United States legally on some kind of non-immigrant visa to apply to adjust their status to lawful permanent residence early without being subject to the numerical limitations that are currently causing them such long wait times if they've been waiting in line for at least 2 years and they pay a fee for advanced adjustment of status. And the effect of that could dwarf even the effect of the recapture provisions. And so recapture is really a one-off surge of green cards to correct previous errors, but advanced adjustment of status offers this opportunity for a new program to prevent backlogs from growing out of control, at least as much as they are now, and providing new green cards above the current restrictions that are acting as a drag on our economy.
That's great. And I want to move on to our economy because that is sort of a big upside of both of these provisions. Your calculations on the economic impact of recapture are pretty striking. In some estimates, as high as trillions of dollars added to our GDP in the next decade. So I want you to talk a little bit about your estimates, but also a question that was just raised is whether or not any of the revenue from these positions, from these provisions could go to bolstering USCIS, which we know in recent years has sort of been in trouble as far as funding is concerned. So if you could kind of address both those points, that'd be great.
Yeah, let me address the point about USCIS revenue first. The short answer is yes. Many of these proposals include supplemental fees. So for instance, the Build Back Better Act includes supplemental fees for a lot of these visas, in addition to other kinds of fees, fee increases, and new fees like those that would be required for advanced adjustment of status. And these should help USCIS with their processing. And some of these proposals also include direct appropriations, which should also help USCIS address some of their processing issues that they've encountered. On the other question about the economic estimates, so there's a wealth of economic research on the effects of immigration, and even the most pessimistic estimates in the literature tend to show that immigrants are net positive to the economy. They tend to complement U.S. workers and increase U.S. production. And so for my estimate, I took two of the models from the existing economics literature. I took one from an economist named Giovanni Peri, and I took another from the, and he's on the more optimistic end of the effects of immigration. And I took another model from the labor economist George Borjas, who is perhaps the most pessimistic about the effects of immigration. And to be clear, even George Borjas thinks that thinks the economic impact of immigration on that is positive. The total magnitude might be slightly less, and he has concerns about the distribution of the benefits. But there's a broad consensus that the effect is positive. And so I took those two models, looked at the number of new arrivals who would be receiving green cards under each of these proposals, which is smaller than the total number of green cards that's being recaptured, and depends on specifically how those proposals break down along family-based and employment-based lines, and then just average those two estimates. My own personal opinion is that it's likely to, the actual economic effect is likely to be even higher than that average, because I'm inclined to think Perry's model is more accurately describes the economic effects of immigration. But I just took the average, and there we see for the recapture alone in Build Back Better, it'd be about $1 trillion to GDP over 10 years. Cap exemptions could potentially double or triple or quadruple that number. The DHS Appropriations Act, because almost all of its green cards would go to new arrivals, would generate over $400 billion over 10 years. And the Preserving Employment Visas Act, unfortunately, the minority of those are new arrivals. And so while it does do a lot to help employment green card recipients, because only 16,000 of them would be new arrivals, the estimate for that is only about $27 billion over 10 years. And yeah, it's still billion, which is nothing to ignore. And because this is only looking at the effect of new arrivals, it would also tend to understate the economic benefit of these proposals, because we'd also expect, if immigrants are free to switch jobs, if family members are free to work, that these are also would also have positive economic benefits that I just haven't estimated. And so I think all of these are also conservative estimates.
So even giving these pretty promising conservative estimates, you know, it's kind of confusing, at least to me, and maybe, you know, an outside audience, that, you know, put lightly, there's still a lot of political strategizing and policy negotiations that are happening on reconciliation kind of behind closed doors, and in particular because we are now awaiting on a new CBO score on the most recent provisions. So I know you don't have a crystal ball, but how do you expect the CBO score to impact these negotiations and potentially the timeline for Build Back Better, which we have seen extended multiple times and is now rumored to potentially be pushed out until January of next year?
On the timeline point, I think it will pretty clearly push the actual votes into December or January. As far as how it will impact the negotiations, I think if CBO does score the recapture and advanced adjustment of status provision, which there's no guarantee that they will. I think it will make the immigration provisions a lot more attractive to Democrats. So right now, the only thing that, as far as I know, has been publicly reported on as far as the CBO score on immigration in the reconciliation bill has been provisions for the undocumented. And those largely are going to increase a lot of spending because they're addressed at people who are already present in the country and are already contributing taxes. And it might affect a little bit about how much taxes are collected from them, but by and large, they're people who are already contributing tax revenue. And what the provisions might do is change how much they can receive in benefits. But and so that has been the basis of the CBO score on the immigration provisions thus far. But if they also were to score recapture and advanced cap exemption, it would not be addressed mostly at people who are already present, or at least if it depends, again, it depends on how the breakdown is between employment and family-based green cards. But it would also bring in a lot of new arrivals who are not contributing any taxes presently, and would be contributing a lot more. And I think that would make that would have an enormous positive impact on what the net fiscal impact of immigration would be if it's included in reconciliation.
That's great. I'm gonna pause quickly because we are getting lots and lots and lots of questions, and with 3 minutes left, there is no possibility that we will be able to address them all. So please feel free to follow up with us via email if you want to chat a little bit more about some of these questions. I think a lot of them are really good, but I want to close with one. So in almost every newspaper last week that came out, I read some story about labor shortages across the country in pretty much every sector. And it sounds like they'll be exacerbated by the holiday season. It seems like a lot of places are having trouble finding holiday workers. So given the shortage of workers in America now, how might provisions like recapture sort of impact labor demand in the US in the more kind of immediate short-term sense?
I think on the labor demand side, I mean, as we know, immigrants aren't just part of the labor supply, although that's very important. But they also spend, and so I think they would increase labor demand. But I think the key point is on the labor supply side, and here we see a tremendous amount of new job openings. I think the most recent figures that I looked at are over 10,000 job openings on non-farm work, and that's 3 million higher than the number before COVID. And so if you have a huge supply side issue and a lot of new job openings, jobs being unfilled, and production being stopped from that, I mean, that's going to contribute to inflationary pressures. This is one way by helping to address those labor supply issues with new immigrants is going to be a way to help reduce that, and it's not going to be the key policy lever, but I think it is important. And one of the lessons I think that we could take from the response to the Great Recession is in the depths of the Great Recession, the same concerns about immigration that we might hear today existed then, and we reduced migration then, especially in H-1B, and people who have researched that have suggested that slowed the growth in jobs for U.S. native workers in the following years, in 2009, 2010, and 2011. And if we don't try to increase immigration now for fears about U.S. workers, we might be hurting US workers again, just like we did then.
Absolutely. And let's hope that your words hit the ears of the folks negotiating this bill on the Hill soon, and we get an answer soon. So in our last seconds, I want to thank everyone for attending, and of course, Jeremy for joining us today and offering up his deep expertise in this area. For more information on immigration policy, including a recording of today's event, please visit Niskanen Center at niskanenscenter.org. If you have additional questions, please email us at contact@niskanenscenter.org. And of course, check out all of our work and our hot takes on Twitter at Niskanen Center, at KDP in DC, and at Jeremy L. Neufeld. Thank you all.